All right, so let's get started with the week 3 lecture. So there's not a clear segue between week 2 and week 3. Week 3 and week 4 are sort of lumped together. So we're starting up with something kind of different this week. Um, we are doing a different subcategory of philosophy. So in the first week we did metaphysics. In the second week, we did some philosophy of science, and now we're going to do something a little bit more theoretical. It's epistemology. And the big topic, sort of foundational topic in epistemology, is radical skepticism. So what is that? Well, radical skepticism is this idea that we can't know anything. And as I've said once or twice before, epistemology is the philosophical subdiscipline that deals with knowledge. What is knowledge? When do we have it? What counts as good evidence for belief, etc., etc. So let's get right into this. So as I said, radical skepticism is this important topic. It's not necessarily something that most epistemologists believe is true. Most epistemologists think that what they need to do is demonstrate that radical skepticism is false. However, it's notoriously difficult to do in a thorough, principled, non-question begging way. So the question here is whether we are in a position to know anything, and if we were, would we be in a position to know that we know anything? And those are two separate questions. You can already see how this would get a little bit convoluted and, as I said, very theoretical. So the first question is, do we know anything, right? So do we know that there's an external world? Do we know that, just think of anything that you take yourself to know. Radical skepticism is this idea that we don't know anything at all. We could be a bit more circumscribed and be skeptics about more narrow fields of knowledge. For instance, there is a kind of prominent idea of moral skepticism, which we'll look at much later in the course. The idea being that we don't have moral knowledge. There are not moral facts that we are aware of. We could be skeptics about, aesthetic facts. We could be skeptics about just the external world, so on and so forth. So when you see the word skepticism, whatever word is before it is telling you what thing that position takes us not to know anything about, basically. So as I said, this idea or this question about whether and when we know things is pervasive. We're always kind of anxious about whether we know things or whether the world that we see is illusory in some way. So this idea of external world skepticism, whether or not we actually know things about the external world, shows up in a lot of science fiction type stories. It shows up in some religious beliefs. So for instance, in Buddhism, or at least one variety of Buddhism, there's this idea that the world that we see and touch is an illusion, right? That's not the way things really are. And it is part of the task of becoming enlightened for the Buddhist to realize that these things are illusory, that the sensory world is illusory, and sort of stop believing in it and stop attributing value to it. In terms of kind of in sci-fi, popular culture type stuff, well, just think of The Matrix, think of Inception. These are both films in which the idea is, well, what if everything that you take yourself to know is false? You're being deceived in some way, or you're actually just dreaming. That second part, which is the topic of Inception, that's what you'll be looking at in your groups and individually for this week's reading. And it's quite a long argument and a longer reading than last week's and the one before that. So this is what radical skepticism is. This is why it's important. It's not just something that philosophers are concerned with. It's this idea that has sort of, tickled at the back of everyone's mind forever, basically. So the first thing we're going to look at is one of the primary sources of theoretical skepticism, right? So it's not just some emotional anxiety. This is putting forward a set of reasons as to why we can't really ever justifiably hold beliefs. So let me read through these premises here. Premise 1. If any believer is reasonably or justifiably to hold a belief, then that believer must do so on the justifying basis of another justified belief. Premise 2. If a believer reasonably holds a belief, then that believer must reasonably hold another belief to justify that first belief, and a third belief to hold that second one, and a further fourth belief to hold that third one, and so on. Call this a chain of reasons. First conclusion. This is an intermediate conclusion. It's not the end of the argument yet. If a believer reasonably holds a belief, that believer must have a justifying chain of reasons. Move on to the second page of premises here. So the arguments are getting a bit more complicated now. Premise 3. If a believer is to reasonably hold a belief, it cannot be on the basis of a circular chain of reasons. Premise 4. If a believer is to reasonably hold a belief, it cannot be on the basis of an infinite chain of reasons. Premise 5. If any believer, should say, holds a belief on the basis of a belief without justification, that believer does not reasonably hold the first belief. Conclusion 2. No believers with chains of reasons with unjustified beliefs as their ends are justified. There's a couple typos in here. All right, third page. It's the last page, I promise. Premise 6. Chains of reason are either A, circular, B, end with unjustified beliefs, or C, are infinite. And the last two are our final conclusions. C3. For any believer's chain of reasons, it either A, goes in a circle, B, ends with an unjustified commitment, or C, goes on to infinity. And the final conclusion, conclusion 4, there are no beliefs which believers are justified in holding. So there's a bunch of typos in there. I need to go clean that up. I think I must have miscopied this from the book. So that is a lot, right? And it's so this is a good example of what I said would happen a lot. It's very repetitive, right? The word belief and believer, saying it so constantly that it starts to lose meaning as you read it aloud. So there's a lot in here, and we're going to need to go through this with a fine-tooth comb. So you'll notice that there are these ideas of circular chain of reasons, an infinite chain of reasons, and then sort of a chain of reasons which ends with an unjustified belief. So there are three phenomena, three theoretical epistemic phenomena that are being looked at here. What does that mean? So they're saying here are three ways in which people do attempt to justify beliefs, right? So they attempt to justify beliefs with fallaciously circular reasoning, which is sometimes called vicious circularity, and that will look something like this. How do I know Sam is telling the truth? Because Sam is trustworthy. How do I know Sam is trustworthy? Because Sam said, I am trustworthy. How do I know Sam, God, more typos, Sam is telling the truth about being trustworthy? Because Sam is trustworthy. This must be autocorrect messing with me here. So I think you get the point. We have a particular belief, and it is justified by another belief, which is in turn justified by that first belief, right? So a circle, right? It kind of goes like this, right? You have belief A. Well, what justifies belief A? Oh, well, B. No, don't do that. Stupid thing. Okay, so we have belief A. I really wish you would not do that. And then A is, this annotation tool is a bit picky. A is justified by B. What is B justified? Well, it's justified by A, right? So this is a circle and really bad drawing. So it doesn't kind of bottom out. There's not, one belief which does the justifying of another and itself sort of does not stand in need in justification. It just goes back and forth. A justifies B, B justifies A, and it doesn't end. Okay, so that's why it's called circular reasoning. Why is that bad? Well, because the first belief, which stands in need of justification, is justified on the grounds of another belief, which uses the first belief to try and justify it. But that first belief was justified in the second one, and so there's sort of, nothing seems to happen. And you can recognize from this example that I gave that sort of thing is not something that you'd be satisfied with if somebody gave that reason to you, right? Okay. After circularity, we have infinite chains of belief, and I think you can get the idea of what that's going to look like. But here's an example. You just say, well, I believe X based on Y, Y based on Z, I believe Z based on some further belief, and you just keep doing this. So this is, imagine a child asking you, why, and you just keep saying something else, and then saying something else, and then saying something else. Oh, well, this because that, and that because this, and it never, ever stops. Each belief is justified by a further belief, and it goes on forever. This idea of an infinite regress is taken to be sort of something bad in reasoning. You don't want to have to give for every belief you have some infinite chain of reasons. Not just because you could never finish giving your justification, although that's part of it. It just seems like that justification never happens. There's never an end point where you can finally say, and therefore that first belief that I started talking about 5 million years ago, well, that one's justified. And then finally, there is sort of just ending this practice, ending this activity of giving reasons with a belief which is itself just unjustified. And so this looks like we're all familiar with this one as well. And why do you believe this? I mean, you just go, I don't know, I just do believe it. I don't have a reason. I can't give you any evidence, I just do. That's what the sort of unjustified endpoint looks like. You'll appeal to some causal thing. You'll say, well, I don't have a reason for it. That's just how I was raised. I don't have a reason for it. It just feels right. I don't have a reason for it. Someone hit me on the head. Now I believe it. Okay? That's what the unjustifiability thing looks like. So those are the three types of attempted justification activities that Sextus Empiricus, his regress argument, is going for. Who is Sextus Empiricus? I don't mention that at all. Sextus Empiricus, maybe I say it later in the slides. This is a Roman skeptic. In the time of the Roman Empire, he may have himself been Greek, and in fact, I think he was Greek. And he was putting forward this school of thought. He's putting forward what's called this trilemma, and I do think I talk about this in a minute. So this is not a new sort of thing. This argument has been around for more than 1,000 years. So let's talk a little bit more about this sort of thing. In general, with knowledge, right? Knowledge, to know something, that thing has to be true. Okay, so you can't know that Bill Clinton is the current president of the United States because Bill Clinton is not the current president of the United States. You can't know that it's sunny outside because it's not, right? It's currently cloudy outside. So to know something, that thing must actually be the case. This is referred to as the factivity of knowledge. Now, of course, when you have a belief, when you say it's raining outside, or I believe it's raining outside, you can't know that unless it's true. But its being true isn't enough, right? You can believe that it's raining outside. It can actually be raining outside. But you don't count as knowing just because your belief and the truth coincide. You additionally have to have good reasons for believing that thing, right? You have to believe that it's raining outside. What we would usually take as a good reason would be something like, oh, well, I looked outside and I can see water falling from the sky. Or, oh, I looked at the weather report and it says it's raining. Oh, my roommate looked outside and said, hey, Evan, it's raining. And those we count as sort of good reasons. What this regress argument is doing, what Sextus Empiricus regress argument is doing, is telling us that we never have good reasons. It's not saying anything like, well, there's no truth, so we can't know. He's saying, well, there is truth, or there might be truth, but that kind of doesn't help us because we can never give a justification for our beliefs. Why not? Well, because the only ways in which we can attempt to give justification are these circular arguments, no good, these infinite chains of reason, no good, and then these chains of reason which end in an unjustified belief, also no good. So we never know anything according to this argument, again, even if the things we believe are true. And so this shows one of the very important and foundational concepts, ideas in epistemology, that there is a difference between knowledge on the one hand and true belief on the other. And a great deal of epistemological literature, especially the older classical epistemological literature, is trying to figure out what on earth is that difference. What's the ingredient that you add to true belief to make it knowledge? These early accounts are suggesting that something like justification. So knowledge is justified true belief. And that's sort of the way the story goes, is that that's the classical original picture until sometime in the early 20th century. And from the early 20th century onward, we've had, basically for the past 70 years, we've had people after that justified true belief theory is overturned trying to come up with what the actual theory is. And so that's what a lot of epistemology is these days. There are many other things that it talks about, but that's one of the primary ones. So here's where I talk a little bit about the history. Sextus Empiricus is not really putting forward anything new. So Sextus Empiricus, I think, if I remember correctly, is a Roman. He's in the Roman Empire, and he's doing what a lot of people in the Roman Empire did, is he's translating and sort of maybe sprucing up stuff from the Greek philosophers. So as I say, he's reporting and updating the works of Pyrrho, Anisimedemos, and Agrippa. So I said this phrase, Agrippa's trilemma, earlier. This regress argument in which you have three choices, all of which are bad, that's Agrippa's trilemma. So this school of skeptical thought is called Pyrrhonian, after Pyrrho of Epirus there. The goal of this type of skepticism, or this goal of this epistemological theorizing, is peace of mind. Ataraxia is a Greek word. It means peace of mind, or more accurately, mental tranquility. And the idea is that you get this mental tranquility through epoche, which is suspension of judgment. How does this work? Well, because of this trilemma, this regress argument, which says any attempt at justifying a belief is going to fail. If we're constantly still trying to justify this belief, we're basically going to be really stressed out. We're going to hold this belief, we're going to say, oh, it's raining outside. And then people are going to ask us to prove it, and we're going to be in arguments trying to prove it to them, and it's not going to work, and we're going to be really frazzled by all this. The Pyrrhonians say, well, look, what you should do is you should just not have any beliefs. You should just say, well, it may be raining outside, maybe it's not, I don't know. Now, you may already have this idea that sounds really impractical, right? You just have to believe some things in order to get around in a daily life, or you don't really have a choice. So, Pyrrhonism, Pyrrhonism is not clear that anyone could actually ever do it, but nonetheless, that's their goal. And this is not unique to this Greek type of skepticism. If you look into some of the statements of Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, you'll see this mantra: in order to have knowledge, you must first have no opinions. That's something that in the recent Netflix Iron Fist series, the goofy Danny Rand character says that at some point really early on. And when he says it sounds really dumb. And maybe it's not plausible, but that again is this this mantra of more than one ancient school of thought, is that in order to truly see how things are, or in order to avoid having false beliefs, you just have to have no beliefs at all, basically. So there is, probably a negative reaction. This argument is saying, hey, guess what? You don't know anything. All your beliefs are unjustified. And we're all going to think to ourselves, well, surely we do know stuff, right? Surely there's something wrong with this argument. And indeed, there are many responses to this argument. We won't go through them. I think your textbook mentions a couple of them. And so epistemologists have spent a great deal of time trying to see ways out of this trilemma by either saying, well, there's actually a fourth way that he didn't talk about, or by saying, well, look, there's nothing wrong with all circular beliefs, or infinite chains of reason are okay, so that's fine. Not chains of reason that you actually have to spend the rest of time saying, but the fact that in principle one of your beliefs is backed up by an infinite chain of reasons isn't so bad. And then probably one of the more popular ways to go is to show that, well, look, there are some beliefs that don't need justification. They justify themselves, or something like that. Foundational beliefs. And that is a huge chunk of epistemological literature, trying to show foundational beliefs. So René Descartes, and it's an argument of his that you're going to be looking at for your reading sequence this week, he spends a lot of time trying to develop a sort of foundationalist epistemology in which there is this foundational belief upon which you can build everything else. And you've all heard of this phrase, I think, therefore I am. That is Descartes' foundational belief. He thinks, look, that doesn't need the justification of a further belief. It just justifies itself, and then we can build everything else on top of that. Roughly, that's how it goes. Okay, so that'll be the end of the first part of the week 3 lecture. I'm going to, cut off this recording, and then I'm immediately going to start the next one, where we're going to talk about a different anti-skeptical argument.